He closed his eyes during the session and found himself floating, not falling, not rising, just suspended in a space that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light. And then he realized something that made his heart stop. He'd never been born before. Not once. Not ever. The therapist's voice was distant now, like an echo from another room. Marcus felt his body relaxing deeper into the chair, his breathing slowing, his mind quieting. But instead of going backward into a past life like he expected, he found himself going somewhere else entirely. The sensation was strange. He could still feel the chair beneath him, still hear the soft music playing in the background, but his awareness was expanding outward, stretching beyond the boundaries of his body, beyond the room, beyond anything he could name or describe. He wasn't in a place. He was in a space between places, a realm where physical laws didn't apply, where time moved differently, where he existed without form or substance, just consciousness, pure awareness, floating in an ocean of light that seemed to breathe and pulse with its own rhythm. This wasn't a memory. Or maybe it was the only memory that mattered. The memory of what he'd been before this life, before Marcus, before human. Marcus had come to the hypnotherapist because he felt incomplete. His whole life, 34 years, he'd carried this nagging sense that something was wrong with him. Not wrong in a way he could fix with therapy, or medication, or lifestyle changes. Wrong in a deeper way. Like he was missing some fundamental instruction manual that everyone else seemed to have been born with. He watched people live their lives with a confidence he couldn't understand. They knew how to be human, how to want things, chase goals, form attachments, care about careers and relationships, and all the things that were supposed to matter. Marcus could mimic those behaviors, could go through the motions, but it never felt natural. It felt like acting, like he was playing a role he'd never auditioned for and didn't quite understand. His therapist had suggested past life regression after traditional therapy hadn't helped. Maybe there was some trauma from a previous lifetime. Some unresolved issue that was bleeding through into his current existence. Marcus was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. Now, floating in this space of light, he understood. There was no past life to access, no previous incarnation to explore. Because he'd never done this before. He'd never been human before. He'd never been anything physical before. The realization hit him like a wave of ice water. How was that possible? Everyone had past lives, right? Souls reincarnated over and over, learning and growing through multiple lifetimes. That was how it worked, but not for him. For him, this was the first time, the only time, and suddenly, everything about his life made sense. The confusion, the feeling of not quite fitting, the sense of being an observer rather than a participant. He wasn't broken. He was just new, a soul experiencing physical existence for the very first time. The therapist's voice reached him from far away, asking him to explore this space, to understand where he was and what he was experiencing. Marcus let his awareness expand further, and as it did, he began to perceive more details about this realm he was floating in. It wasn't empty. There were others here. Countless other points of consciousness, each one a soul like him but different. He could sense them around him, some close, some distant, all existing in this same space between worlds, and he understood, without being told, that this was the place souls went between lives, the space they returned to after death and departed from before birth. Some called it the spirit world, some called it the interlife, some called it heaven. But those were just words. Human attempts to label something that existed beyond language. What mattered was that this was real, this was home, and Marcus had been here for a very, very long time. Memory began to flood back. Not memory in the way humans experience it, with a linear sequence of events, but more like layers of knowing revealing themselves. He remembered being here, in this space, for what felt like eternity, watching, learning, preparing. He'd been part of a soul group, a cluster of consciousnesses that existed together, learning from each other, growing together. Some were old souls, beings who had incarnated hundreds or even thousands of times on various worlds. They carried wisdom and experience that Marcus could only begin to comprehend. Others were younger, newer, but still far more experienced than him. And then there was Marcus, the one who had never left, the one who had watched all the others come and go, returning with stories of their lives, their experiences, their lessons learned. He'd absorbed all of it, learning vicariously through their journeys, understanding the nature of physical existence without ever experiencing it himself. He remembered the discussions, the soul conferences where groups would gather to process what they'd learned, to share insights, to help each other understand the deeper meaning of their experiences. He'd participated in those, offering perspectives and observations, but always from the outside, always as someone who knew the theory but had never lived the practice. He remembered the guides, the advanced souls who helped others plan their They would work with souls to design lives that would provide the specific lessons and growth opportunities needed for each individual's evolution. Marcus had watched countless planning sessions, had seen souls choose their parents, their circumstances, even their challenges and tragedies, all carefully selected to maximize learning potential. And through all of it, Marcus had never felt ready to go himself, never felt prepared to take the leap from this safe, peaceful realm into the chaos and intensity of physical existence, because physical life was intense. Marcus understood that from watching the others return. When souls came back after a lifetime on Earth or any other physical world, they were different, changed, sometimes traumatized. The experience of being in a body, of being subject to pain and fear, and all the limitations of material existence, left marks on consciousness that took time to heal and process. He'd seen souls return broken, confused, lost in the memories of lives where they'd suffered terribly, or caused others to suffer. He'd watched the guides work with them, helping them understand the bigger picture, reminding them that it was all temporary, all part of the learning process. But the pain was real while it lasted. The fear was real. The suffering was real. Marcus had been afraid. That was the truth he'd hidden from himself. He was afraid to incarnate, afraid of pain, afraid of forgetting who he truly was, afraid of getting lost in the illusion of physical existence and never finding his way back. So he'd stayed, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, watching the others in his soul group come and go. They would encourage him, tell him about the beauty of physical existence, about sunsets and music and the taste of food and the feeling of a lover's touch. They'd describe the profound growth that came from facing challenges, from overcoming obstacles, from learning to love in the face of fear. But they'd also return with stories of war and disease and heartbreak and loneliness. They'd describe the heaviness of physical bodies, the prison of linear time, the frustration of being trapped in a mind that couldn't directly perceive spiritual truth. And those stories reinforced Marcus's fear, gave him reasons to justify staying in the safety of the spirit realm. His soul group began to evolve without him. Those who had been his peers advanced to higher levels of consciousness through their accumulated experiences. New souls joined the group, younger and less experienced. But they too eventually incarnated and began their own journeys of growth. Marcus became an anomaly, a soul who had existed for so long without ever incarnating. The guides began to express concern. This wasn't healthy for his development. Experience was essential for growth. He couldn't evolve through observation alone. At some point, he needed to participate, needed to live, needed to take the risk. He remembered the conversations with his primary guide, a being of immense wisdom and compassion, who had incarnated thousands of times and now served to help others plan their journeys. The guide's essence felt both masculine and feminine, or perhaps neither, existing beyond such human categories. Marcus thought of the guide as Lumina, though that wasn't really a name, just his attempt to put an identity to something that transcended identity. Lumina had been patient with him for longer than most guides would have been. But eventually, even Lumina's patience had limits. The message became clear. It was time. Marcus could no longer remain in the safety of the spirit realm. He needed to incarnate, needed to experience physical life, needed to take the risk he'd been avoiding for so long. The choice was presented to him not as a command, but as a recognition of necessity. His soul had learned everything it could from observation. To continue evolving, he needed direct experience, and the longer he waited, the harder it would become. So a life was planned. Carefully, meticulously, with more support and guidance than most incarnations received. Because of Marcus's unique situation as a first-time soul, Lumina worked with him to choose circumstances that wouldn't be too overwhelming but also wouldn't be too easy. He needed challenges to grow, but not so many that he'd be crushed under their weight. They chose his parents, a couple who were spiritually aware, who would raise him with some understanding of the bigger picture, who would support his sensitivity and not force him into molds that wouldn't fit. Not perfect parents. Perfection didn't exist in physical reality and wouldn't serve the learning process anyway, but good enough parents, parents who would love him and give him a foundation to work from. They chose his location, his era, his basic physical characteristics. They identified key people he would meet, souls from his group who would also be incarnating around the same time, who could serve as allies and teachers and mirrors for his growth. And they identified his primary lesson, the core thing he needed to learn from this incarnation. Integration. Marcus needed to learn how to fully inhabit physical existence, to be present in the moment rather than always observing from a distance. He needed to learn to participate rather than just watch, to feel rather than just understand, to live rather than just analyze. It was a lesson specifically designed for someone who had spent too long in the spirit realm, too long in the realm of thought and understanding without the grounding of physical experience. Marcus remembered agreeing to the plan, remembered the mixture of excitement and terror he felt. This was finally happening. After all this time, he was going to incarnate, going to be born, going to experience physical life for himself rather than just learning about it secondhand. He remembered the preparation, the process of lowering his vibration from the high frequency of the spirit realm to the denser frequency compatible with physical matter. It was like descending through layers of atmosphere, each one thicker and heavier than the last. He remembered connecting with the consciousness that would become his mother, with the tiny forming body in her womb that would become his physical vehicle. The process of merging his vast, formless awareness into that tiny, limited form was disorienting, like trying to pour the ocean into a cup. And then he remembered the veil descending, the forgetting, the walls closing in around his consciousness as he became trapped in the limitations of a human brain, a human body, a human perspective. The last thing he remembered from the spirit realm was luminous presence, a final reassurance. You will forget, but I will be with you, always. You will feel alone, but you are not alone. You will doubt, but trust the journey. This is what you came here to do. And then nothing. Just the darkness and pressure of the womb. The muffled sounds of the physical world filtering through layers of flesh and fluid. Marcus experienced his birth from this new perspective, the trauma of it, the violent transition from the warm safety of the womb to the cold, bright, noisy, outside world. His first breath burning his lungs, the overwhelming assault of physical sensations, sounds, lights, touches, all of it too much, too intense, too real. He'd cried. Of course, all babies cry when they're born, but his crying wasn't just the reflexive response of new lungs filling with air. It was grief, the grief of a soul who had just lost everything it knew, who had been cast out of paradise into this strange, frightening realm of matter and time. Growing up was confusing. Marcus the baby, Marcus the child, didn't consciously remember the spirit realm or his choice to incarnate. The veil of forgetting had done its job. But some part of him, deep in his subconscious, remembered. And that part of him resisted being here, resisted fully inhabiting his body and his life. He was a quiet child. Observers described him as thoughtful, sensitive, perhaps a bit too serious for his age. But what they didn't see was the constant internal struggle. Marcus felt like he was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. The human body, with all its needs and sensations and limitations, felt foreign. The human mind, with its constant chatter and emotional turbulence, felt overwhelming. He'd watch other children play with an intensity and engagement he couldn't match. They seemed to naturally know how to be present, how to lose themselves in the moment. Marcus could mimic the behavior, but couldn't access that same quality of presence. He was always slightly removed, always observing himself and others as if from outside, never quite able to merge fully with the experience. His parents noticed. They tried to help, thinking maybe he was shy or anxious or on the autism spectrum. They weren't wrong exactly, but they also weren't quite right. What Marcus was experiencing wasn't a disorder or a personality trait. It was the natural result of being a first-time soul trying to adjust to physical existence without any previous experience to draw on. School was difficult. Not academically. Marcus was actually quite intelligent, able to understand concepts quickly, but socially and emotionally, he struggled. The unwritten rules of human interaction, the subtle social cues that others seemed to pick up naturally, were mysteries to him. He had to consciously study and analyze behavior that should have been instinctive. Friendships were shallow. Relationships were superficial. Not because people didn't try to connect with him, but because Marcus couldn't figure out how to let them in. There was a wall between his consciousness and the world, a barrier he didn't know how to cross. As he got older, the sense of wrongness intensified. He went through the motions of building a life, got a degree, found a job, dated occasionally, maintained a small circle of acquaintances. But none of it felt meaningful. None of it felt real. He was going through the steps of human existence without experiencing the substance of it. Depression wasn't quite the right word for what he felt. Disconnection was closer. Displacement, like he was a foreign exchange student in a country where he did speak the language and could understand the culture. Everyone around him seemed to intuitively understand how to be human. Marcus had to fake it, and the constant pretending was exhausting. That's what had finally brought him to the hypnotherapist. The exhaustion of pretending, the loneliness of never quite connecting, the desperate hope that maybe, somewhere in his past, there was an answer to why he felt this way. And now, floating in this space of memory, understanding flooding through him, Marcus finally had his answer. He wasn't broken, he wasn't defective, he was just new. A soul experiencing the intensity and confusion of physical existence for the very first time, without any previous lifetimes to cushion the shock or provide context. As Marcus floated in this space of understanding, something shifted. A presence entered his awareness, familiar and comforting. Lumina, his guide, the being who had helped him plan this incarnation. Lumina's essence wrapped around him like a warm blanket, and suddenly Marcus wasn't alone in this space anymore. He could feel his guide's compassion, the deep understanding and acceptance that had no judgment in it, and Lumina spoke. Not with words, but with direct transmission of meaning. Marcus, you've been so hard on yourself. You've judged yourself as failing when you were simply learning. This is your first life. Your first experience in a physical body. Of course it feels difficult. Of course it feels strange. You're learning something that others have had dozens or hundreds of lifetimes to practice. Marcus felt tears on his face, realized his physical body in the therapist's office was crying, even as his consciousness floated in this other realm. The relief of being understood, of being seen, was overwhelming. But Lumina wasn't finished. You came here with a specific purpose, Marcus. Not just to learn how to be human, though that is part of it. You came here to bring something. First-time souls carry a gift that experienced souls often lose. You see this world with fresh eyes. You're not weighed down by karmic patterns or past life traumas. You're not stuck in the ruts that repeated incarnation can create. Your sense of observing from the outside, the quality you've judged as a deficiency, is actually your strength. You can see things that others miss because they too immersed in the game to perceive the bigger picture. You can ask questions that need to be asked because you not conditioned by lifetimes of accepting things as they are. The world needs first-time souls, needs the fresh perspective, the innocent questioning, the refusal to accept that things have to be the way they've always been. You're here to disrupt patterns, to offer new possibilities, to remind others that there are different ways of seeing and being. Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest. All this time, he'd thought his difference was a problem to be fixed. But what if it was actually his purpose? What if the very quality that made him feel broken was exactly what he was supposed to bring to this world? Lumina continued. You chose parents who were awake enough to support your sensitivity. You chose a time period when the world was beginning to question old paradigms and open to new possibilities. You chose circumstances that would allow you to eventually find your way to understanding, like this moment right now. None of this was random. None of this was a mistake. Marcus thought about his life with new eyes, the moments that had felt like failures. What if those were actually necessary? What if struggling to fit in had kept him from getting trapped in conventional thinking? What if his inability to fully immerse in physical existence had preserved some connection to the spirit realm that others had lost? What if he wasn't supposed to be like everyone else? But the doubt remained. If this was all planned, if this was all serving his growth, why did it hurt so much? Why did the loneliness feel so crushing? Why did every day feel like a struggle just to exist? Lumina's presence pulsed with understanding. Physical existence is hard, Marcus, even for souls who have done it hundreds of times. It's still hard. The density, the limitations, the forgetting, it's all intentional, but that doesn't make it easy. You're not supposed to enjoy every moment. You're supposed to learn from every moment. And learning often involves discomfort. But here's what you haven't understood yet. You've been holding back. Even after incarnating, even after being born into this life, part of you never left the spirit realm. Part of you has remained here, in this safe space, observing your life rather than living it. That's why it feels like you're watching from outside, because you are. You haven't fully incarnated yet. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd incarnated, hadn't he? He had a body. He was alive. How could he be more incarnated than he already was? But as soon as the question formed, he understood the answer. Incarnation wasn't just about having a physical body. It was about fully inhabiting that body, fully engaging with the experience, letting go of the safety of spiritual detachment and allowing himself to be vulnerable to the full range of physical and emotional experience. He'd been holding back, keeping one foot in the spirit realm, maintaining a thread of connection to this safe space so that he would get completely lost in the intensity of physical life. It was a survival mechanism, a way of protecting himself, but it was also what was preventing him from actually living. Lumina's message came with a question that was not really a question because the guide already knew the answer. Are you ready now, Marcus? Ready to fully be here? Ready to let go of the safety net and dive completely into this experience you chose? Fear rose up in Marcus, the same fear that had kept him from incarnating for so long, that had kept him half in and half out of this life for 34 years. What if he let go completely and got lost? What if he forgot the spirit realm entirely and became trapped in the illusion of physical existence? What if the pain and suffering were too much, but underneath the fear was something else, a longing, a deep, aching desire to finally know what it felt like to be fully alive, to experience life not as an observer but as a participant, to feel everything, even the painful things, with the full intensity that required complete presence. And in that moment, Marcus made a choice. The same choice he'd made in the spirit realm when he'd agreed to incarnate, but this time with full awareness, this time knowing exactly what he was choosing. Yes, he was ready to fully be here, ready to live this life completely, without holding back, without maintaining an escape route back to the spirit realm. The moment he made that choice, everything shifted. It was like a dam breaking, a flood of energy and presence rushing into his physical body. He felt himself snapping into alignment with his human form in a way he never had before. For the first time in his entire life, he was fully here, fully incarnated, fully present. Marcus opened his eyes in the therapist's office. The room looked the same, but everything felt different. His body felt different. Heavier but also more solid, more real. His senses felt sharper, more vivid. The colors in the room seemed brighter. The sounds seemed clearer. Even the feeling of the chair beneath him felt more immediate, more present. The therapist, whose name was Dr. Sarah Klein, watched him with quiet attention. She'd been doing this work for over 20 years and had seen many profound regressions, but something about Marcus's expression told her this had been particularly significant. What did you experience? She asked gently. Marcus tried to find words, but they felt inadequate. How do you explain that? You just realized you've never fully been alive, that you spent your entire existence as a consciousness observing life rather than living it, that you just now, at age 34, actually incarnated for the first time. He did his best, and Dr. Klein listened without judgment. When he finished, she nodded slowly. First-time souls, she said, they're rare, but I've encountered a few over the years. They have a particular energy, a kind of innocence mixed with confusion. They're trying so hard to figure out how to be human, and they do understand why it is so difficult for them when it seems easy for everyone else. Marcus felt validation wash over him. He wasn't alone in this. Others had experienced the same thing. Does it get easier? He asked. Now that I understand what's happening, does it get easier? Dr. Klein smiled. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Understanding helps. Knowing you're not broken helps. But you're still learning how to be human, and that takes time. The difference is that now, you can be patient with yourself. Now you can see your struggles as part of the learning process, rather than evidence of failure. The weeks that followed were strange and intense. Marcus felt like he was experiencing everything for the first time, which in a sense he was. Now that he'd fully incarnated, now that he was completely present in his body and his life, sensations that he'd been dulling or avoiding hit him with full force. Food tasted different, stronger, more vivid. He'd been eating his whole life, obviously, but now he could actually taste it, could appreciate the complexity of flavors, the textures, the pleasure of satisfying physical hunger. It was revelatory. Music affected him differently. He'd listened to music before, enjoyed it in an abstract way, but now he could feel it in his body, could let it move through him, stir emotions, create resonances in his chest and bones. He found himself crying while listening to songs he'd heard 100 times before. Now finally, understanding the emotional depth they carried. Physical touch was overwhelming. A handshake, a casual pat on the shoulder. These simple interactions that he'd barely registered before now sent waves of sensation and information through him. He could feel other people's energy, their emotions, their intentions, all transmitted through the simple act of physical contact. And emotions, oh, the emotions. Marcus had always felt things, but from a distance, muted, manageable. Now they hit him with full intensity. Joy that made him want to laugh out loud, sadness that brought him to tears, anger that heated his chest, fear that made his hands shake. It was exhausting and exhilarating and sometimes completely overwhelming. He called Dr. Klein a few times in those first weeks, needing reassurance that what he was experiencing was normal. She reminded him that he was essentially a newborn in an adult body, learning to process sensations and emotions that most people had 34 years of practice handling. Of course, it was overwhelming. Of course, it was intense. That was part of the process. She also reminded him of what his guide had told him. He had a gift, his fresh perspective, his ability to see things that others missed, because they were too conditioned by repeated incarnation. He needed to trust that gift, use it, share it. Marcus started to do that, at work, where he'd always just kept his head down and done his tasks. He started speaking up in meetings, asking questions that challenged assumptions, suggesting approaches that seemed obvious to him but that no one else had considered. His coworkers were surprised at first, used to quiet, passive Marcus, but they also started to listen, started to value his input. In his personal life, he took risks he'd never taken before. He reached out to people, initiated conversations, allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways he'd always avoided. Some of those attempts failed, led to awkward moments or rejections, but some of them led to genuine connections, real friendships that had depth and meaning. He met a woman named Alina at a meditation class. She was an old soul, he could feel it, someone who had incarnated many times and carried wisdom from those experiences. Normally, he would have been intimidated, would have assumed someone like her couldn't possibly be interested in someone like him. But now, with his new understanding of his own value and purpose, he approached her confidently. They talked after class, and he found himself telling her about his regression experience, about being a first-time soul. He expected her to think he was crazy, but instead her eyes lit up with recognition. "I wondered," she said, "there's something about you, a quality I couldn't quite place, a kind of innocence that's really rare. I thought maybe you were just very sheltered, but this makes more sense." Alina became his teacher in a way, helping him navigate the aspects of human existence that were still confusing to him, but he also taught her, offering perspectives that made her reconsider things she'd taken for granted after countless lifetimes of assuming that's just how things were. Their relationship deepened, became romantic. Marcus experienced physical intimacy fully for the first time, and it was nothing like the distant, mechanical experiences he'd had before. This was connection. This was vulnerability. This was two consciousnesses meeting through the medium of physical bodies. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely overwhelming. He struggled sometimes. There were days when the intensity of physical existence felt like too much, when he wanted to retreat back into observation mode, back into the safety of detachment. But Alina would gently remind him, "You chose this. You incarnated to experience this. Don't run from it now." And she was right. He had chosen this, and now that he'd committed to fully being here, he couldn't go back, didn't want to go back, despite the difficulty. Marcus also discovered that being a first-time soul came with certain advantages. He had no karmic baggage from previous lives, no patterns he needed to break, no traumas he needed to heal, no relationships he needed to resolve. His slate was clean. That meant he had a freedom that many people didn't have, the freedom to create his life from scratch without being unconsciously influenced by past life experiences. He started exploring different paths, trying different activities and interests to see what resonated. He took up painting and discovered he had a natural talent for it. His fresh eyes seeing colors and shapes in ways that others found unique and compelling. He started writing, journaling his experiences, and found that his perspective on being human for the first time resonated with others who felt like outsiders even if they deincarnated many times. He joined a spiritual study group where people explored consciousness and reincarnation and the nature of existence. There, he found others like him, not all first-time souls, those were still rare, but people who had struggled to fully incarnate, who had spent years feeling disconnected from life. His story gave them hope. His growth showed them what was possible. Marcus realized that his purpose, the reason he'd finally incarnated after so long, wasn't about achieving some great accomplishment or becoming someone famous or important. His purpose was simpler and perhaps more profound. It was to learn how to be fully human, fully present, fully alive. And in doing so, to show others that it was possible, that no matter how disconnected you felt, no matter how much of an outsider you seemed to be, you could learn to inhabit your life completely. He thought often about the spirit realm, about the soul group he'd left behind, about Lumina and the other guides. Sometimes late at night, he'd sit in meditation and reach out, trying to reconnect with that space between worlds, and he could feel it, still there, still accessible. But it felt different now, less like home and more like a memory. Because this was his home now. Earth, physical existence, this body, this life, this moment. He was no longer the soul who watched but didn't live. He was Marcus, fully incarnated, fully present, fully here, and it was hard and beautiful and painful and joyful and everything he'd been afraid of and everything he'd been longing for. One night, about a year after his regression session, Marcus had a dream. He was back in the spirit realm, floating in that space of light. His soul group was there, and they surrounded him with love and recognition. They'd been watching his journey, proud of his progress, celebrating his growth, and Lumina was there too, the guide's presence warm and approving. You did it, Marcus. You finally learned to live. The dream ended with a feeling of completion, of accomplishment, but also of beginning. This was just the start. He had an entire lifetime ahead of him, decades of experiences still to come, but the hardest part was over. He'd crossed the threshold. He'd learned to be human. Maybe you're a first-time soul too, struggling to understand why being human feels so foreign. Or maybe you're an old soul who's forgotten how precious this experience is, how rare and valuable it is to have a physical body, to live in a world of sensation and emotion. Either way, remember this: you chose to be here, chose this life, this body, this moment, and that choice matters. Your presence matters. The simple act of being fully alive, fully present, fully here, that's the whole point. That's the gift you came to give. Subscribe for more stories from souls who remembered why they came.